My name is Dr. Alistair Vance, and this is the story that completely changed the way I see death. For nearly 20 years, I worked inside one of the busiest trauma hospitals in the United States. During that time, I witnessed hundreds of deaths. For most people, death feels mysterious, almost unreal. But in medicine, it isn't. It's structured, it's documented, it follows procedures. There are forms, signatures, identification tags. Everything is carefully controlled to the point where mistakes are almost impossible. At least, that's what I used to believe, until October 11th, 2021. That night, a patient named Harold Whitmore, 63 years old, was being treated in our ICU. He had been admitted with severe respiratory failure, the result of years of chronic lung disease that had slowly destroyed his lungs. Despite everything we did, his condition kept getting worse. At 2:36 a.m., his heart rhythm began to collapse. The alarms went off. The team rushed in. We performed chest compressions, administered medication, used defibrillation. But sometimes, medicine reaches its limit. At 2:48 a.m., Harold Whitmore was pronounced dead. The room fell silent, except for the long, continuous tone of the monitor, a sound every hospital worker instantly recognizes. After that, everything followed routine. The ventilator was turned off, the IV lines were removed, his body was cleaned, wrapped, and prepared. 2 identification tags were attached, one to his ankle, one to the outside of the body bag. Every detail was checked. Everything was precise. At 3:15 a.m., his body was transported to the morgue. I signed the death certificate. Then I made the call. His wife, Margaret Whitmore, answered. Her voice sounded exhausted, like she had been waiting for this moment. When I told her the news, she didn't cry right away. There was just silence. Then she quietly asked, "Can I come see him?" The next morning, she arrived with her son. They were escorted to the viewing room. Harold lay there, his face carefully prepared so the family could say goodbye peacefully. Margaret held his hand for nearly 20 minutes. Then they left. At that point, everything was still normal, until 3 days later. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Margaret, but her voice was no longer filled with grief. It was something else. Confusion. "Doctor, I think something is wrong." I paused. "Wrong in what way?" There was a moment of silence before she spoke again. When I attended the funeral viewing, the man in the coffin didn't look like my husband. At first, I assumed it might be the embalming process. Sometimes chemicals and cosmetic preparation can slightly alter a person's appearance. But then she continued. His hair was shorter, his nose looked different, and she hesitated. He didn't have the tear on his ear. That detail immediately stood out to me. Harold had a small tear on his right ear, an old injury from his teenage years. It was something very distinctive, not the kind of thing you could easily mistake. But she was certain. The man in that coffin doesn't have it. For a moment, I said nothing. Then I opened the hospital records. His intake photograph appeared on the screen, and there it was, the tear, clear as day. At that point, a thought began forming in my mind. What if the body had been switched? I went down to the morgue and reviewed the transfer logs. Everything appeared correct, but one detail caught my attention. On that same morning, 2 bodies had been released to the same funeral home, handled by the same transport team, and according to the morgue technician, they had requested to be alone with one of the bodies for a few minutes before transport. Just 2 minutes. But 2 minutes is enough to do something. That night, I called Margaret again, and she told me something even more disturbing. The coffin used during the viewing was not the one she had purchased. During the viewing, it was a high-end mahogany coffin with gold handles and velvet lining. But according to the contract, she had paid for a much cheaper standard model. The next morning, before the burial, the family insisted on seeing Harold one last time. When the coffin was opened, they noticed something immediately. It was not the same coffin. And worse, the body inside was still not Harold. At that point, authorities were contacted. The investigation confirmed it. The man inside the coffin was someone else, a man named Gregory Bell, and Harold was found in the funeral home's preparation room, unprocessed, still inside the hospital transport bag. And even worse, his identification tag had been cut off. What happened next revealed something far more disturbing than a simple mistake. Investigators discovered a hidden room behind the preparation area. Inside, there were hydraulic lifting tables, metal rollers, and multiple open coffins placed side by side. This was not a normal preparation room. It was a transfer station, a place designed specifically to move bodies from one coffin to another. The truth began to unfold. This funeral home had been running a deceptive practice. They used expensive coffins for public viewings to create the illusion of luxury. After the family left, they would transfer the body into a cheaper coffin, the one actually purchased. And the expensive coffin would be cleaned, polished, and reused for the next funeral. Some had been used more than 30 times. No one knew, no one questioned it, because once the coffin is buried, no one ever sees it again. But in this case, they made a critical mistake. 2 bodies, similar age, similar appearance, handled at the same time. And somewhere in that process, they removed the identification tags too early and placed the bodies in the wrong coffins. When they realized the error, they didn't fix it. They tried to hide it. They cut off the tags, relabeled the bodies, and continued as if nothing had happened, until one small detail exposed everything: a torn ear that was no longer there. In the end, the funeral home was shut down for investigation. Harold's body was finally returned to his family, and he was buried properly days later. But some things cannot be undone. Margaret had spent her final moments holding the hand of a stranger, crying over someone who was not her husband, saying goodbye to the wrong person. After that case, I continued my work as a doctor. I still signed death certificates. I still witness death regularly. But now, every time I do, I can't help but think about one question. We spend our entire lives trusting systems, trusting hospitals, trusting the people who handle what comes after death. But once we're gone, are we really still protected? Or does the story of our bodies end up in the hands of people we know nothing about? What do you think? Was this just a rare mistake or something that happens more often than we realize? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.